Hey everybody, welcome to our training, our UAWD 23-25 training, Reclaiming the Shop Floor. Really excited to see everyone here from so many different shops. My name's Navruz. I'm a paralegal, a tenant rights paralegal at NILAG, one of our 23-25 shops, and I'm a proud member of UAWD. We have a number of presenters tonight from across 2325 from a variety of different shops and job titles, all also proud UAWD members. But to kick us off, I'm going to turn it over to Ben.
For those of you who I don't know, I know many of the folks on this call. I'm Ben. I'm support staff at UJC. It's great to be here with y'all tonight. Really excited about this training. This training, as we can see, is called Reclaiming the Shop Floor and Legal Services. Um, and so UAWD, for anyone that may not know, is a caucus of UAW members dedicated to class struggle in our locals and across the UAW. We formed in 2019 to win one member, one vote, and to reverse decades of concessions and collaboration between UAW leaders and the companies. Our UAWD platform describes five key pillars of class struggle unionism that you can see here. So we fight for worker control over the shop floor and across the economy, treating contracts as a minimum and not a limit, and rejecting labor management deals that trade our power for temporary gains. Winning that control requires militancy, rank and file workers ready to take collective action, including disruptive tactics that shut down production, ruling class, and build worker confidence. Our fights must be grounded in working class solidarity that crosses borders and identities, recognizing that workers rise or fall together, and that imperialist war and global exploitation weaken us all. We practice democracy as a source of power, insisting on member-led decisions, open bargaining, and collective control over strike strategy, so workers trust and own their union, our union. To make all this possible, we maintain political independence from bosses, bureaucrats, and capitalist political parties, so the working class can act in its own interests and build towards its own political future. And today we'll be talking in more detail about worker control and what that means and looks like to us. Um, so worker control starts on the shop floor over schedules, discipline, supervision, and place of work. It extends to control over our sectors, how they're structured and what they produce. And ultimately, it means collective control over the economy as a whole, replacing production for private profit with democratic control by the working class, often termed socialism or communism. Um, and we're going to be talking more today about in detail about worker control of the shop floor. So, wanted to pose a question to everyone here. What are some of the issues that shape our day-to-day experience at work and shop floor issues that folks run into on the day-to-day? And there's no wrong answers here. So, would love to hear from folks. So we have levels of staffing. Thank you, Stephania. Workload, Navruz, unreasonable deliverables. Shelly, micromanaging. Booge is on stack. What you got, Booge?
Yeah, I feel like for me right now, it's like a combination of all of these things. The short staffing leads to workload and unreasonable deliverable issues. And I have a micromanaging supervisor who also doesn't pull her own weight and just micromanages and puts everything on the two of us on the team that are doing things way outside of our job description. And I think just like framing for the rest of this training, like it's all within the framework of like this boss v worker kind of power dynamic where she's just being a manager. She's just pushing things around, pushing things across her desk, and she sees me as the hands and the mind who will complete the work that she just conceptualizes and she doesn't actually understand because she's not the worker doing the work. So she has unreasonable deliverables for me because she doesn't understand the timeliness, the actual work required to do it. So I think it's just good to tie everything together for the rest of this training.
Thank you, Booge. And yeah, oftentimes I feel like if we're dealing with one of these things, to your point, we're dealing with like all of them. And Aiden on stack.
Yeah, I think adding to that, lack of training, I think kind of goes hand in hand with a lot of these issues, both of supervisors, but then also, us not giving us, sufficient training to be doing the jobs that we're being asked to do, not providing us with the resources to do that. And then also, I think it often feels like we're putting out fires constantly rather than working to address the actual structural issues that are present or that our jobs are dependent on.
For sure. Thank you, Aiden. Anything else? These were all really good. And I know they all like resonated with me. I feel like myself and my coworkers deal with this stuff every day. Is there anything else that anyone wants to add before we move on? I'll give it one more sec. Salary. Yes. Thank you, Lauren. I know a lot of the CEOs and EDs make in the hundreds of thousands, like well into the hundreds of thousands, sometimes like 15, 20, 25 times what we make and what our coworkers make, um, which is just theft. Lack of infrastructure, for instance, not enough physical desks for everyone. Yeah, thank you, Simon. We in our staff meeting yesterday at UJC, we're just talking about like at Safety Net Project, talking about that issue, and I feel like that's a recurring one as well. So yeah, we touched on a lot of these issues here, the issues that shape our everyday work. And folks mentioned this, how much we get paid, also including retirement, health insurance, how discipline and termination are used against us, how long we're forced to work, and how intense the work is, caseloads. And then in manufacturing, it can be like line speed, the conditions we work under, and whether the job is safe, surveillance, like inspecting our workspaces or tracking our time and location, abusive supervisors, and decisions about staffing, hiring, layoffs. On every issue here, management and worker interests are diametrically opposed. So bosses want more control, more speed up, lower labor costs, while workers want safety, dignity, stability, and control over our time and labor. There's no neutral ground on the shop floor. Every gain for management comes at the workers' expense, and every gain for workers constrains management's power. Unions can be tools to assert worker control over all of these conditions, but they can also be co-opted to push workers to abandon these fights. And so there's kind of a tension or contradiction that we see there. And I'm going to pass it over.
Hi, y'all. I'm Estefania, she, her client advocate at Cal. Now, before we can talk about what fights for worker control can look like today, we have to understand the kind of history and context of how we got to where we are. Starting with the communist-led Farm Equipment Workers Union, which is an example of what real worker control can look like in practice. At International Harvester, FE workers carried out thousands of strikes between 1945 and 1954, not just during contract fights like we tend to do, but anytime management tried to speed up work or deny pay or assert unilateral authority on the shop floor. In The Long Deep Grudge, which is a book that documents the experience of the FE, there was one shop floor leader that describes how he would confront the supervisor over an issue and warned that if he were to walk out of that meeting without a solution, then the entire department was about to go home for the day and shut down production. And so this constant collective use of labor power really allowed workers to win these day-to-day battles, to enforce their own standards on the job, and ultimately to exercise real control over production. But recognizing the threat of this organizing model, the company eventually ended up coordinating with reactionary leadership within the UAW and used anti-communist hysteria to raid and take over the FE. And so, despite this, though, today former FE shops like John Deere are some of the most democratic and militant in the UAW. Now, in the early years, though, the UAW did follow a really similar militant model of class struggle rooted in constant shop floor confrontation with management. Workers would use strikes and slowdowns and collective action to challenge the speed up of production, to challenge discipline and the boss's authority on the job. But in 1950, UAW President Walter Reuther, who's pictured here, inaugurated a new model of unionism that was defined by collaboration with management. And so in this picture, you can see Walter Reuther shaking hands with some auto executives over the landmark agreement that's known as the Treaty of Detroit. And under this contract, the union ended up trading the right to strike over grievances for the right to arbitration. They ended up trading control over the pace of work for raises and pensions, and ultimately ended up giving up worker power for economic security. And once that power was surrendered, the gains ended up being temporary because once the workers no longer had the leverage to shut down production, companies ended up rolling all of those benefits back. Now, today, auto workers hired after 2008 have no pensions and they still lack the power to strike over speed up or grievances, which shows how trading power for benefits really just ends up meaning that you lose both. Now, in the years that followed, unions across the labor movement ended up following the UAW's example and channeled class struggle into these really bureaucratic processes like arbitration and formal bargaining. And this shift gave management the upper hand by replacing direct shop floor conflict with these slow procedural battles that can be delayed, appealed, and managed while production continues going on interrupted. And we can see this ourselves in kind of arbitrations and grievances that we do, right? Because on the shop floor, workers have real power. We have the power to slow or shut down production or stop business as running from usual. And that's why management works really hard to keep the conflict from playing out there. Because by moving the disputes out of the workplace and into arbitration rooms and bargaining tables, management protects production, they isolate workers from one another, and it turns collective struggle into these really technical processes where bosses retain control and we, the workers, are forced to wait and concede. We can see this in practice and see the issues that the labor movement has abdicated just by looking at our management rights clauses. These management right clauses are a staple of modern union contracts, and they're really a ridiculous concept when you think about it, because they start from this assumption that management has total control and total authority over the workplace, except for where we, the workers, can claw back these really narrow exceptions, right? So in practice, what it means is we can usually leave wages and benefits as bargaining issues while we concede on almost everything else. On the screen, you can see this management rights clause from NILAG, which gives management the unilateral authority to determine the content of programs, to supervise and direct the workforce, to decide how many workers there are, assign duties, discipline, discharge, layoff, all of these things. Essentially, every issue that shapes our daily working lives is, through this clause, declared to be management's sole prerogative. And while there are in CBAs and other parts language that partially constrains some of these powers, this clause ultimately sets the baseline and the framework. So other provisions don't really challenge management's control, they kind of just negotiate around the edges of it. So starting from this framework means that we are always on the defensive, right? We are always fighting to limit the powers that we already agree that the boss should have in the first place. And this shift in contracts is also mirrored in labor law with the 1947 Taft-Hartley Act, which was explicitly designed to weaken the labor movement after this huge strike wave of the 30s and the 40s. The Taft-Hartley Act banned solidarity strikes, it banned secondary boycotts, it restricted mass picketing, it allowed states to pass right to work for less laws, and it gave employers and the government new tools to intervene against strikes. So together with the Treaty of Detroit, Taft-Hartley helped channel class struggle into these really narrow, manageable venues. And management's push to strip workers of shop floor power was really just one tactic in what has been a much larger resurgence of capitalist power over the last century. This has been deployed alongside welfare rollbacks, anti-union legislation, free trade agreements, subcontracting, public sector austerity, which we've seen, and more. And at the same time, unions have increasingly failed to fight back through strikes. And this chart kind of shows the results of that. Workers produce all value, but only part of it is returned to us as wages and benefits. Economists call that the labor share of income, right? The blue line on the chart. And the rest of the value we produce is extracted by owners through profits, dividends, and stock buybacks. And the red line shown is strike activity. And so you can see as strike activity collapses, the share of income that is going to workers also falls with it. And so this chart shows not just that exploitation exists, but that it has deepened as unions have abandoned militant class struggle. And I'm going to pass it to, I believe, Jeremy.
Hello, I'm Jeremy, he, him. I'm at the Legal Aid Society. I'm a tenant attorney. Um, and here's the question. Who enforces labor law? Stephania says union staff, as a former union staffer. Our labor attorney in the chat, supervisors and union bureaucrats, the government, definitely, and police. That's a good list of people. Well, a fairly complete list of people, I should say. Um, so yeah, cops, judges, and other arms of the state suppress workers on behalf of the bosses. But there's only so many cops and judges. And in order to have the capacity to suppress the entire working class, capitalists rely on unions to police themselves, as some people were saying. So officers and staff often invoke labor law to warn against action. At worst, even our shop stewards will enforce the boss's rules and the state's laws by telling their coworkers to not take action. I've been guilty of this myself, right? We'll talk about that a little more too. But it's not about bad individuals. Sometimes the union staff may support actions that violate the contract, and sometimes a judge could rule in our favor, but more often than not, these structures serve to suppress shop floor struggle and channel into it the boss's bureaucratic procedures. It's like 80 years of this, of obey now, grieve later. Who has heard this before? I see some thumbs up, some raised hands. I've said it before. And it's unfortunately a common refrain, which is repeated by staff and stewards. And it's the idea that we should accept management's authority on the shop floor, and even if it violates our contract. And then we can contest it through the grievance process and arbitration. But if we accept the framework of labor law and our contracts, that's solid legal advice. However, it's terrible organizing advice. Under this perspective, we allow management to create the reality on the shop floor. And then months down the line, we're relying on an arbitrator to save us. And if the arbitrator rules against us when the time comes, it's often too late to organize shop floor power. Because we've been telling our coworkers just to accept this new reality for months. And the moment of agitation has passed, which is the moment when we could be making our reality as workers. And what we should be doing instead is organizing while the issue is live. Because when management imposes something new, that's the moment when workers are angry, paying attention, and willing to act. Rather than telling people to comply and wait, we should be talking collectively about what leverage we have on the shop floor and how to use it. And grievances and arbitration can be part of that strategy, but they should follow shop floor action and not replace it. The goal is to contest management's authority in real time by acting together, disrupting business as usual, and forcing management to negotiate on the shop floor, which is where our power actually comes from. So we have various sources of protection: the legal, the collective, and the community and the political. When management attacks us, we have to make a tactical assessment of how to respond. If our action is protected by labor law or our contract, that's wonderful. But the law is just one source of protection. It's not the only one. If a large group of workers participates in an action, it becomes much harder for management to retaliate, even when retaliation is technically legal. And you can look through history, and there's like decades where management could have done certain things but didn't do things because they didn't think they had the power to do it, even if legally they could. Community and political support can also raise the cost of retaliation and constrain management's options. And we'll give some examples later about, what that looks like in a practical sense. Um, but we know that management retaliates against workers for legally protected activity all the time. Many of us probably have stories. At the same time, there are many cases where management has backed off from retaliating against unprotected activity because the workers acted collectively and had broader support. And so that's why our strategy has to be flexible and grounded in power, not permission, making tactical choices about what will actually shift the balance of forces, even when the law or the contract is against us. And I should just say, in, ALAA, we should all understand that the law is fake. So now we can go to the next section.
Hi, I'm Shelley, she, her. I'm a paralegal at NILAG. And here to, give some examples. So, even though uh, we've been talking about some trends in the labor movement that make things seem a little bleak, there are really important examples in the UAW of workers reclaiming control of the shop floor. And in each one, the pattern is the same. Workers didn't win by, sticking to the confines of labor law, contracts, or even the grievance procedures designed to protect production and protect management control. They won by moving beyond those limits, by acting collectively, using militant tactics, and reasserting power directly on the shop floor. And these cases matter because they show that worker power doesn't come from paperwork or from legal recognition. It comes from workers acting together at the point of production, disrupting business as usual, and forcing management to respond. So here we have some, our UAW siblings in Local 22. So I think this was earlier this year, I think, or I don't know if it was last year, at the General Motors Detroit Hamtramck assembly plant. Management began laying off workers while forcing the remaining staff to do two jobs at once. Workers filed multiple group grievances, but they knew that paperwork alone was not going to force management to change course. So they backed those grievances up by slowing down production with a coordinated work to rule campaign that was led by UAWD members in the plant. And so work to rule, it meant doing exactly what management's rules required. Nothing more, nothing less. So, when bosses would assign someone to a second job, that worker would immediately hand in their walkie-talkie from the first job, making it impossible for management to force them to do both jobs at once. Others, they challenged management on job descriptions, which, then required management to prove on paper that their orders were legitimate. And the managers found themselves scrambling, trapped by their own, ridiculous rules. And workers understood the risk of retaliation. So they were meticulous in this action. No lateness, no phone use, right? These are also rules of the workplace. And more confident members stepped forward publicly as leaders so everyone knew who to turn to. And they coordinated closely with their union rep, making sure that they were ready in case management escalated. And on the day of the grievance meeting with upper management, everyone wore red. This is a big thing if you go to like Black Lake, for example, is a big thing in the UAW Red Shirt Wednesday. So everyone wore red, and that visibly demonstrates to management the collective force behind those grievances. And the result was the workers won their grievances. They fought overwork and they restored jobs that had been eliminated. But more importantly, they won confidence. By backing paperwork with shop floor action, they proved that management's power depended on their compliance. As one worker put it, we can be scared of them or they can be scared of us. So now some questions for the audience. So who was the target of this action? The bosses. Very true. It is the bosses, managers, but ultimately the people who cut the jobs. Yeah, I think it is worth pointing out though specifically that they were targeting the managers, right? Because the work to rule campaign, it's like the managers were the ones who had to enforce those rules. What leverage did they use? Productivity, solidarity, very true, right? Certainly the action would not have been as successful if only one or two people had done it, right? It would have undermined the action if there were a bunch of people going around business as usual and just complying with the situation, and there were some people who were engaged in the action, which is a work to rule action. So part of the really actually the leverage here is like they were slowing down production by engaging in the rules. It's a very interesting action in that it's kind of showing like how the rules and management's expectations don't really align. And what sources of protection did the workers rely on? The CBA? Yeah, that was one thing they relied on. Anything else? Each other, yes. So true. Yeah, no, it's true. Like they did have to rely on each other, on the collective participation. On the one hand, they were sort of like relying on this like technicality around the work to rule and like the protection of that, but really, yeah, it's exactly what y'all are saying. If they didn't all do it, it wouldn't have been so successful. So that management couldn't fire them all. Management's inability to do the work themselves. Very true. There's no way, even if the managers wanted to, that they could have gotten on the shop floor and done all of those jobs. So this, I think we could all say this sounds like a really successful action, a really great example of workers engaging in some real, like militant, worker-oriented class struggle unionism. Moving on to another example at the same plant. So at same local, there was another group of workers who confronted management over unevenly distributed overtime, right? And this is, a thing within the auto plants. So management funneled overtime to the first shift, which dramatically boosted their paychecks, but they denied it to the second shift altogether. And so rank and file leaders began organizing a coordinated response, right, against this disparate treatment. And about 50 workers presented written demands to management, and 100 committed to do a work to rule campaign. But this time, the struggle never reached that point. Regional union staff and the president of the local intervened, warning against a wildcat action and urging workers to wait for the grievance process to run its course, right? Obey first, grieve later. So the workers agreed to pause any collective action and see whether the issue could be resolved through the formal channels alone, right? The formal grievance process. And fast forward to today, the grievance process is still ongoing, and the momentum that had been building on the shop floor over this issue has dissipated. So maybe the workers will get lucky and the grievance will be decided in their favor, but it's unlikely. And if it doesn't, it'll be an uphill battle to rebuild the mobilization that they had when the issue first arose. So now some questions about this one. Why didn't the workers take action? The union. Yeah, specifically what and who do you mean when you say the union? Yes, leaders. Let's not third party the union. Let's be specific. Yeah, no, in this case it was, the local president was one of the people who told them to stop. Yeah, the international, they were seduced by promises of service unionism from union leaders and staff. Yeah, no, I mean, like, that is what it is, right? They were told, like, oh, the grievance, like, we got this, don't worry. So, how could the workers in this situation have won their demands? Not rely on the expertise of union officials, true?
I think this is difficult because before the boss, you don't want to show any division in union uh, leadership. But amongst yourselves, I mean, but that only goes to a certain extent. Like, um, I think that if the boss knows that a weak leader has a more militant base that they're trying to hold back, sometimes that works uh, to the people's advantage. Um, but yeah, I think you could pass a vote. You could overrule the union leadership. You could organize um, some sort of, organize against your union leadership the same way you organize against a boss.
Yeah, Jeremy?
It's just interesting because I really like this example because I found even sometimes people don't even want to, like we're having this conversation, but about filing a grievance. Not even like in this example, at least they're pointing to the grievance to drag things out, and calm things down. But so often I'll find myself in conversations like, should we file the grievance or not? Or should we just send an email? Right? Should we threaten to file a grievance? And it's like, at least file the grievance, right? We should really be taking the shop floor. The grievance is the peaceful, is the compromise option. Um, and I just think like, even though this action, yeah, sort of a failure, like it it still points to a different way we can be orienting ourselves in how we like engage as a union with management.
Yeah, totally. That's also, yeah, that's wild. Like there's discouragement from even using like the formal compromised process of ruse.
I think that by the time the union staff and union leadership came around and said, "Hey, like give us a chance with the union procedure," and workers are like, "Okay." I feel like by the time that happens, it's almost it can be pretty tough to like go around to everyone and be like, hey, no, actually, this is bad for all these reasons. And 1950 Treaty of Detroit, Taft-Hartley. I think that in a lot of ways we have to have these conversations beforehand so that uh, we know that this is coming or might come, and our coworkers know that this might come, and then we're kind of ready. That we kind of had a discussion ahead of time. We want to use these tactics outside the procedure, or like in addition to the procedure because it's going to be more effective and this is our power. And even explicitly that some folks might be against this, that some folks have an interest in kind of channeling our energy into the grievance process, and that maybe that doesn't happen. If that doesn't happen, that's great. But if it does happen, we need to expect it and not be caught by surprise and be ready for that.
Definitely, yeah. Which, I mean, as you may have guessed, this is part of why we are putting on this training, and why it's really important to learn about labor history because a lot of the times we're not really aware of what we're up against and how some of the tactics that we are like sort of taught to think of as like being, really sort of final and the only way to deal with things, like really mainly I'm talking about like the grievance process, are actually sort of compromises that were made with uh the bosses, with the ruling class, so that we don't get too rowdy and exercise our real power. But so those were a few examples from outside of our sector and our local. I will hand it off now to Bouge to talk about an example from within our sector.
Yes, hi all. I'm Bujana. I'm at UJCU. I'm also support staff over there. Very excited to be here again. Um, and yeah, I'll be doing an example proudly from our own sector. If y'all weren't there a couple of weeks ago, don't ask me what month it was because truly these months are going by in such a weird way. We had a really great presentation done by folks who were involved in this ICE out direct action at Legal Aid. And I'll get into the details now, but it was a really great event that I think has had echoes of impact. Um, so yeah, so in 2017, ICE escalated their arrests of immigrants in and around New York City courts. Court officers were collaborating with ICE agents directly at the time. They were tipping them off when non-citizens were coming in to the courts, for scheduled hearings on other business, etc. Um, and this was extremely obviously dangerous and disruptive and stressful for both clients and for attorneys who were seeing folks getting detained in front of them. We're going to routine court appointments and we're seeing people get snatched. Um, and it was not only, yeah, deporting and disappearing community members, but it really chilled participation in the judicial processes by the immigrant communities. So, you know, obviously this set off the alarms across sectors, um, and initial worker attempts to stop this practice through official channels fell flat, as we heard a couple weeks ago at that event. Um, we had folks at the Legal Aid Society at CDP. If I'm not mistaken, it was in Brooklyn, was like kind of a core organizing base. Um, there was, but across, the sector, there was like, how are we going to deal with this? Like networks of communication. We are seeing ICE asking managers, like, what do we do? Like our clients are getting snatched, or we're seeing others getting snatched in front of us. And there was just like kind of a whisper, and kind of like a shrug from management, like, we're dealing with it, let us handle it. But like in this like very same like slow, um, no direct or reassuring action. We want to control things so that they're done in like a bureaucratic and quote unquote peaceful manner, right? We don't want to ruffle any feathers. Meanwhile, this is an emergency. Um, so even union leadership was failing to act. Um, it was really at that point the workers realized it was between them um, and each other to figure out a plan. So the union contracts were offering no protection, no grievance process, no legal remedy. Um, In fact, the contract no strike clauses made any work disruption unprotected. That meant discipline for workers and potentially legal and financial consequences for the union itself if workers were to take direct action, like walking out of the courts, which we'll get into the details of. Um, but legal service workers refused to accept that framework. Instead of waiting for permission, they organized across boroughs and across organizations. They held votes at membership meetings and made a collective decision. Whenever ICE entered a courthouse, they would walk out. Just kind of like that. This disrupted the courts and piled on pressure on state officials to solve the crisis. The Office of Court Administrations, OCA, urged the workers to stop the walkouts and threatened to reassign the cases to private attorneys. However, the workers held firm. Um, and I'll just add my own tidbit here from what I learned at that talk. Like, yeah, it was just really impressive. It took months of organizing amongst workers, but obviously, you know, attorneys were seeing their own community members and their own clients being snatched in front of them. Um, their own morals were called into question, like, why are we even in this work if we're not going to actually protect our community members in every way that we can? And I think through that, and the organizing, the meetings, the emotional pull, and the need, when the time came, you know, it was like the week before the action was taken and the walkouts happened, they had authorized a walkout. They had voted to authorize a walkout. One more, snatching, one more arrest in front of us at the courthouses, and we're walking out. 1 week later, sooner than expected, it was called to test, and workers were ready. They left against all, you know, fears, odds. It was the collective action that pulled everyone out. And it was really powerful. And you'll see that it worked. In April 2019, the courts issued a rule sharply limiting ICE arrests in courts. In December 2020, the governor signed a law banning the practice altogether, and the union wasn't bankrupted. The workers weren't disciplined. What changed wasn't the contract or the law, it was the balance of power, reclaimed by workers acting collectively on the job because they had the power to shut down the courts. So question one, who was the target of this action? Yes, city government, um, the court officials, I would say OCA, the government, those who have the power to stop the presence of ICE in the courts, to stop the collaboration between court officials and ICE agents, um, and like on like a underbelly of that. Like, you know, it's something that affected management. Obviously, management doesn't have the power to stop ICE in the courts, so it's different in that dynamic. But, management had the power to collaborate more with workers in devising solutions. And in the end, really the worker power that they demonstrated kind of, a lot of managers, as this is what I remember from the talks, a lot of the managers were like, yeah, like we agree, like we want to do something, but we're scared, right? Kind of like there's procedures to all this. And I think in the end, the level of collective action that occurred and the amount of support that it got and the message that it was also issuing, like, what is management going to now stand up and like support ICE presence in the courts if they're like disciplining workers for what they did? That would go against the messaging and the mission of the organization. So it's kind of a catch-22 that the power of the movement really helped solidify success. I just answered the second question kind of, but what leverage did workers use? Their own power. Courts can't run on their own. Their labor, walk off the jobs so they weren't doing the work. Those are all kind of combined. Yeah, shutting down the courts. No attorneys, can't continue. Um, in the media, yeah, the liberal public facing image, like I was just saying, the messaging, what it would look like if now managers and LAS leaders were saying like disciplining workers and standing alongside this, the wrong quote unquote side of them. And what sources of protection did workers rely on? Because they didn't have contract protection. I mean, what they were doing was quote unquote illegal. Um, yes, solidarity, mass action, like we've seen before. The power of many makes it difficult for folks to really face disciplinary consequences. That's why we see like community support, the political environment, exactly the political climate at the time, just like we're seeing now with Minneapolis and everything. And yeah, media. So altogether, a really, really great example from our own local.
Thank you so much, Viz. Really appreciate it. So we're gonna do an activity now in a second. We're gonna divide up into breakout rooms. Think about a recent issue at your workplace where management exercised control. So some sort of shop floor issue. There's some examples here: discipline, workload, scheduling, staffing, surveillance, policy changes, etc. And then think through these questions, just like we did for the examples. What shop floor leverage did workers have? Uh, were did workers have the power to disrupt production? How could workers resist management's control if it was like sort of a policy change? Did workers use that power either to resist management's control or to disrupt production? Why or why not did they use that power? So the example can also be like at Factory Zero, where we saw one example where they used their power and one where they didn't. And how could you organize to win more shop floor control in your shop in the future? I'm going to open the breakout rooms. We're going to go until 7:15, and then we're going to come back and report back. So please also choose a reporter. Thank you so much, everyone, for sharing. So as I mentioned at the top, we're UAWD 2325. We're the ALA chapter of UAWD, which is a national caucus within the UAW dedicated to building class struggle unionism. If you would like to join and you're not yet a member, I just put the link in the chat. We'd love to have you as a member or as a supporter of UAWD, and you can help us put on more trainings like this. And there's lots of other initiatives and campaigns that we also work on.
Thanks so much, everyone, for being here.
Have a
Thank
nice
you.
night, folks.
Take care.
Thanks, everyone.